Angus,
Very good to see you. No, really, really good. It's so nice to have these types of conversations.
Yeah, we're certainly blessed for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry,
say that again. I missed you.
To have found each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like on the volley chats that we have, it's like on Matt's network as well. Really interesting. So let's dive into this.
All right.
That was my mic. I've got the tab open on another browser. Okay, so let's have a look. I prepared some questions. I thought I'd actually flash up the first one on the screen, just so, and I'll read it because there's a quote which I think is so interesting from Steiner. So if we look at number one, he says the last 60 years represent the age in which the mode of conception of natural science attempted from different points of view to shake the foundation. I'm thinking Steiner here, especially, but not just him. Shake the foundation on which philosophy formerly stood. Jonathan's just joining us. What do you think is going on there? Jonathan, you're going to have to turn the sound off. I think you might have a tab open or something like that because I'm hearing myself repeated.
Okay.
Brilliant. Good. We've just started looking at the first question, Jonathan. I'll just read it out again. So this is taken from the introductory remarks. Steiner says, the last 60 years represent the age in which the mode of conception of natural science attempted, from different points of view, to shake the foundation on which philosophy formerly stood. And what do we think he means when he says that? This last 60 years, he's written this book in 1914. Or published it in 1914. So he's basically talking from the 1850s to 1910. What do you think he's trying to get at here?
He's getting at the point that, like Hegel brought philosophy ever since its birth in ancient Greece up to kind of its culmination. And everyone looked at that fantastic development and was like, what do we do with that? And they didn't know. And so they went right. They sort of, in a sense, turned around and went to the material world and developed.
To add something, Jeffrey, something's coming to mind for me.
Go ahead.
There was a part in the where he talks about the life forces of thinking being exhausted.
Yeah.
In the chapter, which I thought was so expressive, this idea really that there's nothing more to be gotten out of. It's like just viewing the world from this Hegelian way of seeing the world, as in the world is a reflection of spiritual realities, and we get to those spiritual realities by through thinking. I thought that was really, really interesting, this idea of spent forces.
Yes, I think that's right, because I think that the thing was that Hegel presented it almost as not just a sort of like a flower, a plant culminates in the flower, and then it was almost how he presented it, or how people took it, and then it must freeze there and be a flower forever. Instead of, and I think the exhaustion was that people didn't realize that there was more that they could do with it. But because of the magnificence of the flower, it kind of exhausted their sense of what was possible. And so they did, in a sense, they were correct to do the only thing that in that case they could do, is to turn to the natural world and engage. But in another sense, that's a kind of like a backward step, because then we use our thinking to engage with the natural world. So it's kind of still using thinking, but ignoring the fact that one is using thinking.
He also claims here, without substantiating the claim, or substantiating is not the right word, without supporting it, that there is a move by natural science to essentially upend philosophy as some legitimate mode of inquiry, and he doesn't say who did that or what was happening, but it's from this perspective, looking backwards, it's an easy one to say, yeah, that's exactly what was going on, what happened. So there is that in that, and I also in picking up on what you guys were saying, when in the next chapter, when he talks about thinking, I've never uh, um, entertained this concept before, and I must have passed over it the times reading this book before. But he says something like, at the end of his going through the four problems Hegel brought, and then destiny became the final question, and where the limits of Hegel are insufficient for the time that we live in now, or the time that he was then describing then. But he says, is something like, I'm going to paraphrase it, but is thinking all that there is to thinking? You know, is that basically, is thought all there is to thinking, or is thinking more? Can thinking do more, be more, act in the as a deed in the world through an actual relationship with an understanding of that temporal, tragic, as in Zach Stein's language, of the soul life as temporal and tragic, and the mythos that we need to grapple with the reality that we have a psychological organization that's fixed to a dying organization, you know, and that individuation associated with a dying organization, which is the physiological body, is so important to the next phase of what science might look like. So what he's doing is trying to bring together a violently separated science and a sort of by taking the philosophy to its absolute limit, and then turning it into incorporating the scientific method, say.
You see, I've put up a picture. It's like as a background. It's somebody that's been inspired by a guy called Walter Russell, who might be familiar to you guys. I don't know.
Yeah.
Walter Russell. So this is, I think it's called like Werden and Sterben, it's like becoming and dying. And I'm going to link that between to Hegel, because the other picture that he gives about Hegel in this in chapter 11, or the first chapter of part 2, is that thinking has a dissolving quality to it. It's this idea that, so like, if we live purely so like in this thinking realm, we become sort of like our essence dissolves as we dissolve into the world of thinking. We're in these processes, and this is so reminiscent of Schiller as well. But let's just sort of like keep this with Hegel. So you've got this image of us losing ourselves, or the possibility of losing ourselves in thinking. And I find this very, very similar to Walter Russell's ideas of when he uses this imagery of appearance and disappearance, of how it's almost like a cosmic breath of this idea of like stuff is like breathed into existence, it's materialized, it's crystallized, and then inevitably, like everything in the galaxies, in the universe that's matter, it gradually dissolves back into some sort of etheric substance, involved in this like continual breathing process of coming into, when I say coming into being, I mean like manifesting, and then gradually dissolving out again. And that really struck me about his description of, if you like, the downside of Hegel's. It was hugely illuminating, but for the soul in itself, it has a dissolving effect. And this brought me back to the end of chapter 9, where he's talking about talking about Stirner, and it's like the absolute existence of the individual. And so you've got these two opposites like being presented to us in this wonderful way, which also I'm going to like let somebody comment here in a second, but it's like he eventually like leads us into how Goethe becomes like so important in, okay, what do we do with this dissolving effect, plus the fact that we are individuals, like individual spiritual essences. And he does, even before he gets to Goethe, he references Lessing. So like, where's the individual in all of this? Which I think is deeply fascinating. If anybody would like to pick up the thread there.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. You went straight to being and becoming, because I think the thing, that dissolving thing, which incidentally might explain why I think I might have an ulcer, just too much thinking perhaps. But joking aside, the dissolving effect of thought is, it takes us away from the world we are in. And Stirner got to point, like, no, I am, do not dissolve me away into a general I or anything like that.
Yeah.
But then the next step is, and this is what science did, but then because it left out the thinking, it hasn't quite realized its proper mission or step or whatever yet. It turns to the natural world. But then Goethe turns to the natural world, and he looks at growing and becoming, and then he looks at death and decay in the natural world. And that is where the next step is. I just came from a meditation workshop, and this was the thing. Knowledge of the higher worlds indicates that in the world around us, everywhere, are like these doors to clairvoyance. They're the doors to the spiritual world. It's just that we don't attend to them. But if you attend to growth and decay, and you remain with them, then it opens it. It sort of brings, but behind those, there's real forces which will then develop the next stage of our development. And the gentleman I was just with, he described it beautifully, in the sense that a child, it learns to speak by listening. Do you know what I mean? There is some active, like, mimicking and so forth, but the original part is it just listens, and that's listening, really attending to the world around them, develops speech in and out of them. Do you know what I mean? It's just that listening to the natural world activates powerful forces that bring you into a next phase of, or part of development.
Yeah, I don't want to leap into this the first chapter of the second part, but
we're there already. Go on, Jeff.
Well, suffice it to say that the soul is real, right? The soul is not a epiphenomenon.
You're thinking of Troxler here when he starts talking about Troxler.
Well, no, I'm just thinking about the book as a whole, really. And the dissatisfaction the soul will have if we just stay with Hegel, the Hegelian spheres of thinking. It's the soul that dissolves. It's not that there's the substance or force that is the independent soul that wants to come into existence more, wants to invite thinking through its whole processes right into its relationship with the body, the physiological processes. It wants that, and it is not going to be satisfied by dissolving itself into some one world whole. It is indeed going to be part of that one world whole, but it's going to have to go through a death and resurrection first. In the dissolution, the dissolution will be absolute if we just turn back from the abyss and say, well, thinking contains it all, in the spheres of thinking, and the ability to think in this this almost super athletic way that Hegel is able to. And I pointed to this guy, Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's got an amazing mind. But at a certain point, you're going to just keep developing models in order to keep thinking. And when are you going to incorporate, as he says in chapter 1, perception, feeling, and willing.
Willing,
When will
yeah.
you start to embody down that process? And I want to say one more thing, and that is Hegel's is in a sense insufficient for our time, but he was ahead of his time and he's ahead of our time in that he made the move of using thinking to purify the astral body and look into almost like an acid trip, I would say, into the way light is one of the ethers, right? Steiner describes the four ethers, and so he purify the astral body, and you're looking into the etheric world. And so he saw that what's the term, that the appearances that are manifest light are swimming in the light, right? And
Wow.
anybody who's had a sort of slightly out of body experience or a purified astral body experience. I'm not saying that I've got a purified astral body by a long shot. I do not. But in moments I've seen that sort of that which is in between objects, right? And that's just one element of the etheric stream, say. Like there's the chemical ether and light ether and warmth ether, and I forget the other one, but in any case,
Chemical.
I wanted to make sure that I got that in there, because the astral body being somewhat transformed by thinking, its role is extraordinarily important in the soul.
I'm going to. Oh, I didn't mean to press that, but I'll come to that. I'm going to jump in quickly on that point there. As part of my course, I've had to read Don Quixote, and there's a really interesting part in the second part where Don Quixote and his partner Pedro Sancho, they Don Quixote's had actually this like what is basically an initiation sequence in the story, and he's initially sort of like this crazy man, sort of like full of harebrained schemes, like goes charging at windmills with his lance and this type of thing. So he's like totally inspired by all these chivalric tales of old. But after one of the first things that happens to him after his initiation sequence in the caves of Montesino is he starts to chastise Pedro Sancho for talking in parables. Talking in parables is like, and he says something like, "For God's sake, man, use reason your thoughts, and stop sort of like feeding me all these cliches and parables and this type of thing, because that's no longer adequate for investigating the world or for talking about the world." And it actually leads us what you were saying there, Jeffrey. It leads us into the second question that I've put up on the screen here. So again, quoting from the introductory remarks, the significance of these views for philosophy becomes apparent only if one examines the scientific foundations from which they are derived, and if one realizes oneself the tendencies of scientific thinking according to which they were developed. What do we think these natural scientific views are, and what do we think their consequences are? Because I think you were onto it a little bit there, Jeff, already.
I'd just like to quickly mention that there's two things there that I think have to be quite distinctly clarified. Is one is thinking, and the other is the scientific thinking itself, the tendencies, that mode of attending to the world. Because the mode of attending to the world, you could use that in different ways. So you could get different views from that depending on how you use that attending or what you attend to.
But I get your point, Jonathan. But if we just take even if we hadn't read the book, we could still have opinions on what the consequences of natural scientific views are. What do we think? What do us three think they are? You've gone silent.
Let's say we did not read the book and that we were, in some sense, naive to all of this.
Yeah.
You would say, well, you might say, well, my soul is a natural process. My feelings, and um, uh, if I didn't have the preconceived notions of where they come from, or if they were caused by biochemical processes or whatever, I might say that. And I might say that impulse, it's an impulse. The natural scientific impulse is to look at the objective nature, or nature in an objective way, and try to figure it out. And why couldn't I do that? And so and why would I exclude my soul in that process?
Mm.
So the natural scientific views aren't yet, in this question, limited to materialistic, objective cause and effect, probability, causality, all of the things that are smuggled in from Kant, say, right?
Mhm.
So I think that what we're saying is that there's a natural scientific impulse, and rightly so. And so, what does that look like when we train it on the subtle aspects of what it is to be a human being? I think that's one way to take that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you pointed out that the natural scientific views are influencing philosophy, but they themselves are thoroughly influenced by philosophy, and perhaps unconsciously. So, even from as far back as Descartes, where they'd say, okay, we can investigate everything that is extended around us, but everything else is purely subjective and not objective.
Was that question a quote?
Yeah, all of those are quote. All of these are 6 of these are quotes.
Okay, so he's also saying, he's issuing a warning there. He's saying, if we don't know where natural science originates from, we don't know what that impulse is and the thinking associated with it, then we're in a sense where we don't know how to develop it. He uses the term
Right.
develop there. Is that right? Can you put that back up for a minute?
Yeah, sure. One sec. Why I'm going to give my my take on it, and so let's
All right.
see where it leads it. I think this is part of the strengthening of thinking within the individual. We're starting at the sensory experience level, so it's like forcing us to not to like drift away with Hegelian thought. Unfortunately, you shouldn't. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have lost the value of Hegelian thought of seeing the world as an expression of spiritual realities. But this natural scientific, materialistic is the way that I interpreted it when I was reading it, grounds us. It puts both of our feet so like firmly on the earth and says, right, here we are, and let's start applying this ability to think, this ability to discover connections that nobody ever saw before, to piece together how this world is put together. That was my reading of it.
Yeah, I get it. And it seems like such a waste on one hand that the Hegelian is just thrown out with the bathwater as relates to that, and what Hegel represented. And so in a sense, what Hegel obscures again is Goethean science as the natural scientific process that needs to be taken out and needs an epistemology underneath it, which had not yet been done. Hegel could have done it if he wouldn't have turned back at the point of studying the soul as a phenomenon that is not unrelated to the Goethean plant stream, that the Goethean metamorphic picture of the plant, or the archetypal plant, that the soul itself is rooted in a realm that is studyable, something like that. And again, the other part of this is he's kind of saying science is attacking philosophy, that the natural scientific view is attacking philosophy. And it's somewhat inevitable, I guess, from the evolutionary consciousness standpoint, in that, as you said so poignantly just a second ago, Angus, that we're starting with perception, right? If psychology would have realized itself, it would have gone into perception, the nature of perception, the nature of feeling, the nature of the emotional life as a sort of regulatory function, say, or whatever. I'm not going to try to put scientific terms on it, but it didn't. It veered from the phenomena and went straight to this to the it stayed at the level of perception, so never understood perception until now. Cognitive science is starting to develop. For example, I think it has now 10 senses in cognitive science, right? But not quite to 12 senses yet. You know, we haven't caught up with Rudolf Steiner yet at the level of perception. And Steiner, you know, developed a science of perception, feeling, and willing. But he was on his own, right, for the most part, other than us crazy anthroposophists.
Well, it did start with the phenomenologists, which, in a sense, they continued from the idealists, but then took that into a natural scientific investigation
Right.
of the
Well,
soul.
that's good.
But they didn't, you know, in the sort of the battle for the universities or whatever. They
Well,
didn't
that's because
win out.
Brentano, the first one of them, gave up. He himself turned back at that point. And who knows what it was that caused that. It's been a while since I've read Steiner's work on Brentano. He was a student,
Yeah,
as was Freud and Jung. So he would have been
yeah,
contemporaries
but I
as a
think
student, along with Husserl, Freud and Jung. He would have been. Is that right? Husserl was of that time too. Yeah, so they would have been all students of Brentano, and Brentano turned away. He turned away from the phenomenological project as relates to the soul as a natural, scientifically studyable phenomena.
It's just an epiphenomena of an emergent property of matter.
Yeah, well, the pressures of natural science, scientific views apparently had him compromise, I would say, that project. And the 20th century followed. Like it was I'm sorry, this is a big lament of mine. Like what could have been.
I guess.
Yeah, go on, you, Jonathan, first.
But I guess it's because Brentano, Husserl, and Freud, etc., all of them, but they only looked at the soul, and that is the whole point: is that we need to look at the soul and the natural world, and to understand that they are one. And that was the problem. So that's why he had to give up, because just looking at the soul in and of itself, you can't really, I think, get to those forces that are going to make the transmission into the new life.
Well, also witnessing how the soul is formed and shaped out of the spiritual world. So yes, you have to look at the natural world around us and the way in which we are part of this evolutionary process that is in a dance with the natural world. But also the natural scientific view of disallowing the spirit as an existent reality at all as well. That was the death of God that we'll find with Nietzsche coming up, I'm sure. Right. And so that's gone. Like the soul is something. It's like the fox guarding the hen house. You know, there's not an objective relationship with the soul by a spirit that can do the investigation through scientific methodology.
Yeah. And also getting back to this, like having both feet on the ground, if we just try to investigate our soul, so like we're in a very nebulous realm, and who knows whether like what we're onto is true or not true, but we don't have that problem with the physical sciences. It's there, it's clearly demonstrable. It requires it's like a completely different type of training to begin to understand the truths that rule in the realm of the soul and the realm of the spirit. And so I think that'll be part of the weakness of Brentano and these people that sort of like don't feel that they can take it to the next step with phenomenology.
Yes, yeah. It's like they don't seem to realize the point of the soul is to turn to the natural world. And then from the natural world has something to give it that then transforms the soul.
Yes.
And so you've got the phenomenologists on one side looking at just at the soul, and the natural scientists on the other side just looking at nature.
Yeah. Well, Steiner warned also of the surety problem in earlier chapters, that people were moving toward this natural scientific view that then became dominant in his time.
Do you remember? Sorry, Joe, go on.
They they were who was it? It was
You're not thinking about Herbert, are you? Herbert in chapter 6.
The surety of the
Yeah,
mathematical.
that's right.
So it became an actual method for education that is meted out to our children today because of that.
Maths is the lowest
need for security as relates to knowledge, right?
Yeah, and maths is the lowest common denominator. It's the absolutely lowest common denominator because everything, about everything, it's a 1. So do you know it applies everywhere, but it says nothing more than that. So
but it gives you a sense of certainty, doesn't
because
it?
it's so definite. It applies to everything, but because of that, it says practically nothing.
It's so appealing to the clarity of thought once you've learned like a certain amount of mathematics. So people can't deceive you and say that 2 + 2 is 5. If somebody comes along and says to you 2 + 2 is 5, you don't have to rely on authority. You rely on an inner authority to get to the truth. Yeah. This is like one of the essences of mathematical truth. It's not there because of an external authority. It's there because of an internal authority that I have elaborated myself. It's like thanks to thinking.
Well, also this need for grounding as relates to perception, that we're holding on to perception without introducing or even denying conception any validity at all. We're holding on to perception, which is the most superficial aspect of existence, and then we make a science out of just perception, right? It's like Narcissus. It's like the Greeks really, through the mythopoetic comprehension of reality, that is a timeless story. Marshall McLuhan retells it in Understanding Media so beautifully, and in a way, Owen Barfield's work is sort of an understanding of the ways in which saving the appearances means engaging in these subtler aspects that have been denied by a natural science that is so fixated on the absolutely most superficial, which is complicated, so it can occupy your whole life and whole generations because it's extraordinarily complicated, and so it seems to satisfy that mysterious part of us, or the part that needs to be engaged with the mysteries. But it's not complex. It's just all superficiality is complicated, right?
And this is the downside of the natural science. It's like this non-participation in nature. Nature is outside me instead of I am in nature, and all of the processes that are true outside in nature are also true in me. And this is why the fruits of natural science also come with the downsides, and that's what natural science in its thinking has been unaware of. What are the consequences? I mean, we could go full political here, please not, but the consequences of a fragmenting, materializing, segmenting, dissecting way of viewing the world. What happens to the soul when you divide it and cut it up into a billion pieces,
or if you suspend it in computational modeling and computational instrumentation? And like I've said in the volleys, I think that this word instrumentalism is an underused word. It's usually referred to as a sort of heuristic or utilitarian way to look at the world, but we're living in the techne, as they say. We're living in a sort of technological animated state of suspension. in a certain sense, because we've accepted that, like that is that that is the way to relate to the world, is through just amplifying the senses through
Yeah.
and through instrumentation.
Okay, let's move to question 3. I want to get to question 6 because I think it's the most interesting one. They're all interesting, but got number 3 here. So this is the quote here. The book, this book, The Riddles of Philosophy, has attempted to supply the foundation. Will also find it possible to accept the indicated relation between philosophy and natural science. Necessary evolution. You know what? I think I haven't provided enough context there for us to be able to dig into it, unless anybody sees something immediately that's like a thought that's triggered.
Well, I think is he saying that natural science is a necessary evolution from the culmination of philosophy? Because
yes, that's it. That's absolutely it. He's saying this is just like children sort of like have their, it's like they have their first teeth and then they get their second teeth. He's presenting it in this view that we needed this, guys. this is healthy evolution, going down this road for a certain period of time. That's at least my understanding of it.
Oh, that was my experience of the work up to this point. It was like, this is what's next. Yeah, I mean, it's discoverable in the text itself.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because he has to do this introduction to part 2, because the first part was pure philosophy, and the books, it was originally 2 separate sort of volumes, but the overall title of the 2 parts is The Riddles of Philosophy. And so somehow he felt he has to justify, sorry guys, there's going to be, guys and gals, there's going to be lots of science, not just strict philosophy in this next bit. And so, this is part of that, but this is because, it is the way it is, because that is the way it kind of has to be.
It's so interesting, this idea of how you can link into like Goethean ideas of metamorphosis, and what Steiner here is doing is, this is a more helpful way of understanding what philosophy is. It is quite literally like a flower. It's like starting in its seed form, it's growing up, it's like revealing a certain aspect of itself when the leaves come out, and then so like it grows the stem and it grows the flower, and then it gets rid of that flower and creates. And he presents philosophy also in this time image. I want to describe it as like a metamorphosis and a revelation of something else.
It's interesting as well, because if Hegel brings philosophy thinking to its culmination, because it's thinking about itself, it also, this is in a sort of slightly ironic way, that's the philosophy's a thesis. Now here's the antithesis, natural science, and now we're looking forward to where we are right now, the synthesis.
What's the flower going to look like? We've done the leaves. What's the flower going to look like? Type of thing. Or is that how you meant it, Jonathan? That's how I understood it, at least.
Well, I don't know if unless it's the flowers died and there's a seed and something new comes, because the only problem with using the organic metaphor of a plant is a plant reproduces itself, but we're going to reproduce something different from our prior selves.
Yeah. No, I was thinking more in the terms of, so in Goethean science, a petal is just a leaf, but it's not. It's a developed leaf.
Yes.
In that sense. So it's the leaf at a higher stage. But it has to go through this transformation process of like moving from a leaf into becoming a petal or a part of. So like I don't know the technical terms, but it's like often when you've got a flower bud, you've got the protective leaves around the outside of the bud, and those also themselves are just leaves, but they have a different function to the leaves inside. And also the stamen, they are also leaves.
Right.
They're in their essential structure, but they've taken on a different role. They express another they express a further development of what a leaf is.
That's very interesting, Angus, because what you seem to be saying is that whatever was before philosophy, and then philosophy, our way of experiencing the world before we sort of started thinking about it quite intellectually, then philosophy, and now natural science, they are all changes of something. Phase.
Okay, now right, we're there. We're there where I think it's like it's such an interesting thing. And just looking at the time, we've got 15 minutes to go. Let's move to question 6. This one here. So, how should this is a quote from Steiner from in the introductory. How should philosophy understand itself? I mean, this sounds like thinking about thinking for starters, doesn't it? How should philosophy understand itself? What this book means to show is that philosophy, if it arrives at the point where it understands itself, must lead the spirit to a soul experience that is, to be sure, the fruit of its work, but also grows beyond it.
What's funny about that is you were talking about the plant and the seed and the leaf and the flower, and to me, I'm thinking, where's the fruit? Where's the fructification process? Where in this plant does it bear fruit? Is it nutritious? Is it something that sustains life? Do I digest it and turn it into something else because I've come into a relationship in a way that allows for a life process to take on a higher form, in a sense, because of my engagement with it, something like that. It sets off.
I'm gonna riff on your image there, Jeff.
Please.
Where are the bees?
Yeah, indeed. What's happening to the bees?
Oh yeah, I mean there's two questions.
Two questions of the same
character.
the same continuum, I would say.
Are you saying we're just going to be lumps of rotting fruit with the birds and the bees feasting off?
No. I meant I'm thinking of Steiner's image of what the insect kingdom represents. It's the astral world, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a sensorial
or air, pure air. In this terms, the insects are pure air, which you can say is the astral in its soul manifestation.
The question is, how should philosophy understand itself? And the answer is anthroposophy.
Yeah.
Right.
So decode that one then, Jeff.
Well, in the introduction, he says, he makes claims like he does in the first introduction, and then he justifies the last chapter as an addition, because he's saying the next phase of metamorphosis is spiritual science, which is which we've talked about a little bit, the unification of the natural scientific impulse and the philosophical impulse, and I would say also the religious impulse,
and the artistic impulse.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
Yes, for sure. And all of those soul impulses that are sort of, I would say, sub impulses, but these three, the triune impulses. So, and all of those are inherent in what it is to be a human being. Anthroposophia, right? The
wisdom of the
embodied wisdom, yes, inherent in what it is to be a human being, divinely feminine in that case. So again, he's justifying in this introduction, and he uses the word justification. Why he wrote the last chapter is because it's the next step in the Riddles of Philosophy. I asked that question, and I think it was in a volley, but it might have been in the book group. it was in the volley. What is Rudolf Steiner's role in this parade of figures in history? What is his place? Not just his role, but what is his place? His body of work, his thinking, his world conception, and I think that's in this introduction. He's justifying it as, it's a bold move, It's me.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
But if his karma indicates that he's been somewhat successful in the past as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, whether or not that is true, it's beside the point. But the point is that there has to be of Plato and of Aristotle, for example,
And an Aquinas.
Exactly, and there's many more before, and after and around. But there's I say has to be, but maybe that's just at least with philosophy it was that way. And so why not one Giza manages to present, and I mean Giza in quite both senses, manages to present the new phase.
I'm going to go back to the image of the plant and the fruit that you talked about, Jeff, there, because another one of the things that I find so appealing with Steiner's way of thinking is he really invites us to sort of say, don't just take what I say at face value. He says, go and discover how it is true in the outside world. His one way of summarizing his stance on life or stance on spiritual science is, anything that I say is sort of like the way it is, it will have its material counterpart. So going back to the plants that need the fructification by the bees or the wasps or whatever, flies and different types of insects, I think we can also use these as images for understanding, okay, who are the flies for us? So we're talking about the plant. We are, in a certain sense, like this plant of philosophy. What is and we were talking about astral substance, but what is it that actually needs to come to us? How does it come to us so that we go from flower to fruit that Steiner's referencing there? As in the fruit, that's and that I'm not expecting an answer to that question, but that's one of those wonderful questions that you can dream away for a little bit and and suddenly something comes to you and you go, wow.
Well, it's the social impulse, isn't it? That just as a plant, just as the plant world needs pollinators.
Yeah.
And it needs seed carriers to distribute. We need each other as vitally as a plant needs a honeybee.
But do we need more, something beyond our nature? Because the beasts of the field are not of the nature of the plant. So I'm asking: are there other beings of a nature beyond the human nature that we can also need?
I would say yes, but it's not in the book at this point, right? So I really like the idea of grounding ourselves in where we are, phenomenologically speaking, so that when we get ready for the psychologists, we can really take them on.
I think,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. Can I just want to read this bit, because I think this is why this book and the transition is so difficult, because essentially this book is the death knell of philosophy, and he is ringing that bell. He says that the author of this book does not imagine that everyone who can accept the content of the final chapter must necessarily also seek a world conception that replaces philosophy by a view that can no longer be recognized as a philosophy by traditional philosophers. So,
yeah, it's interesting because you could say that Nietzsche was saying the same thing, and that the existentialists were saying, okay, we've done philosophy. It's gone now. Yes, it's going to have to turn into something else. But I also want to pick up that picture of of our need for the spiritual beings, say, that are not incarnate, leaving that saying it, and then leaving that aside, and then saying, making the birds and the bees analogy as relates to the plant and fruit. That is that we it's in the case of that analogy, the birds aren't the plant for sure, and the bees aren't of the plant world. They are from a different realm, but we are all of them.
Yep.
We are insects. We are higher animals. We are lower animals. We're plants. We have all of it microcosmically within us. And until we start to incorporate that, how do we then even have a relationship with the spiritual worlds if we haven't fully incorporated what it is to be in this world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's what he says in the next part of what I just quoted, is some people won't see the need to go there and still just understand the need for philosophy, because it all has to be grounded here in this world still.
Or the soul will not be satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
That's he brings up the riddles of the soul. It's interesting because there's a lecture series or a book, I'm not quite sure which, called The Riddles of the
Yeah.
Soul. And I was looking for it on audio just so I could use it easily as a dovetail, but I couldn't find it on audio. But I have it here on my bookshelf somewhere, but I want to read that in conjunction with this this part of the. I don't remember if it would be itself relevant, but
I think that it has Brentano, and there's sort
I
of
believe
3
you're right.
parts to it. Yeah.
I've got a partial answer to your "what's the birds and the bees" bit. A bit from the fairy tale of the green snake and the beautiful lily. It's what is more valuable than gold? Light. What is more quickening than light? Conversation. Because it is in dialogue that we meet this ability to to grow in our experience of ourselves, but also together with other people. Yep.
Yeah, well, this is the Christ impulse, isn't it?
Yep, very much so. Very much so.
The unicity and multiplicity in they need each other.
That's roundabout perfect timing. We've been going 55 minutes. It was
Yeah, I
quick
think
55 minutes, wasn't it?
we covered the introduction.
We covered the introduction, yeah, but quite a bit more as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Always more.
Yeah. Good. Well, that was a real pleasure. Does anybody want to make us like a closing remark?
Till next time.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I like that.
That's
Okay.
great.
Okay. So signing off. Okay. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.